Well, welcome indeed to this wonderful occasion where we are coming together to celebrate, of course, the 50th anniversary of this great nation, Bangladesh, but also, and I was talking to the High Commissioner, unusually, of course, the 50th anniversary too of Bangladeshi-Australian relations. And it is a wonderful occasion. And of course, for our university, Western Sydney University, it is particularly important, and not least for the Whitlam Institute, which is within our university. So let me begin by acknowledging that we are meeting on Aboriginal lands. People of the Baramatical group, part of the Darug Nation, lived and fished around here. In fact, I can tell you that about 300-400 meters from where we are sitting, the Baramatical people on the Parramatta River fished and caught eels and had ceremonies and gathered berries and hunted. And we know from archaeology that those Aboriginal people did that where we are now for at least 25 and 30,000 years, and probably longer. So I do acknowledge, importantly, where it is that we are meeting on Aboriginal land. I will, as the Chancellor of Western Sydney University, be not only your host for the day, but more nerve-wracking, your MC for this afternoon on what is going to be a wonderful occasion. And my first task is to introduce the Vice-Chancellor and President of Western Sydney University, Professor Barney Glover, who has led our university with great distinction since the beginning of 2014. Under Professor Glover's leadership, our university has continued to increase the excellence of its teaching. The research which we undertake at this university has ranked higher and higher internationally. And more than that, we have a commitment to Western Sydney in terms of how we can contribute to our region, economically, socially, and culturally. And it is Professor Glover, as our Vice-Chancellor, who has led us on that journey. And I know he and I were meeting in here this morning. We actually had our meeting of the Board of Trustees in this very room this morning. And we were telling members of the Board of Trustees how we were looking forward very much to participating in this meeting this afternoon. So please welcome me in joining, asking Professor Glover to come to the lectern. I should say, of course, that Professor Glover is an officer in the Order of Australia for his distinguished service to Australia. Professor Glover.
Thank you, Chancellor. It is wonderful to be here. I also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting, the people of the Baramatical Nation, people of the Baramatical clan of the Darug Nation. It's wonderful to be here this afternoon. Thank you, Chancellor, for those comments. I'd like to particularly welcome some of our special guests who are with us this afternoon, to the High Commissioner, Your Excellency, Mohammed Sufiur Rahman, to the Bangladesh Foreign Minister, the Honourable A.K. Abdul Momen MP, who is online with us from Bangladesh, the Consul General of Bangladesh, Kondakar Masudul Alam, Professor Gareth Evans, AC, the former Australian Foreign Minister who will be joining us. He was Foreign Minister between 1988 and 1996. Professor Dr. Imtiaz Ahmed, Professor of International Relations at Dhaka University. who's with us online, Emeritus Professor Jenny Hocking, Monash University and the Whitlam Institute's inaugural Distinguished Fellow, and Jenny is also online with us. Distinguished guests, of course, and colleagues here on the Parramatta South Campus of Western Sydney University, and those, of course, who are more generally joining us online. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to Western Sydney University and to congratulate the government and the people of Bangladesh on this 50th anniversary of independence. This is, of course, a small event to mark a very big occasion. Such is life under the veil of COVID-19. At the same time, the fact that we gather here after several postponements, the continuing uncertainties, and in the midst of a global crisis, the participation of the Foreign Minister, the Honourable Abdul Momen, and Professor Gareth Evans, the former Australian Foreign Minister, is a measure of the depth of the relationships that bind us. And I know that the Foreign Minister of Australia, Senator, the Honourable Marise Payne, sends her regards to the Bangladeshi Foreign Minister very warmly and apologises she's unable to be here because she's travelling internationally at the moment. As we will hear as this seminar unfolds, it is a relationship between our countries that is founded 50 years ago at the dawn of Bangladesh's independence by two courageous leaders, Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman and the Honourable Gough Whitlam. Mr. Whitlam was a great friend and frequent visitor at Western Sydney University. The Whitlam Institute within Western Sydney University was founded 21 years ago with an agreement between Mr. Whitlam and the university that not only provided for the transfer of Mr. Whitlam's papers and many personal items, but also envisaged an institute that would maintain the enthusiasm for his reforming legacy and to ensure through research and public policy development that the contemporary relevance of that legacy would endure. I can say with confidence that the Whitlam Institute today is a nationally significant institution, the premier institution of its type in this country and a jewel in the crown of this university. There could be no more appropriate host for this commemorative event than Western Sydney University and the Whitlam Institute. We're fortunate this afternoon to have Gough Whitlam's biographer, Emeritus Professor Jenny Hocking, addressing us. And I'll leave to her the particular story of Mr. Whitlam's relationship and leadership and the opening of Australia to our region. I would, however, like to draw on Mr. Whitlam's own account of the Whitlam government to make 2 points. The first is that Whitlam maintained Australia's domestic and foreign policies were linked inseparably. And secondly, flowing from this, that the need to address Australia's treatment of First Nations peoples at home was inseparable from overcoming the fear of foreigners that crippled Australia's foreign policy. Whitlam foresaw an Australia confident of its place in the world and, more importantly, secure in its relationships with its regional neighbours. That Australia is manifest in this university. Our university's campuses sit on the lands of the Darug, Tharawal, Eora and Wiradjuri nations, lands on which these peoples have lived and learned and taught for tens of thousands of years. Our community is home to the largest Indigenous population in the country, and our university is committed to becoming a national leader in Indigenous higher education. We have nearly 50,000 students enrolled, over 60% of whom are the first in their family to attend university. Their family origins are as rich and diverse as the peoples of this planet. Western Sydney University enjoys a myriad of connections with Bangladesh. While we have memoranda of understanding with a number of universities in Bangladesh, including the University of Dhaka, the North-South University, and Maran University of Engineering and Technology, It is the increasing depth of relationships forged between research institutes, scholars, and students that will define an enduring relationship in the years ahead. This is exemplified by this university's Humanitarian and Development Research Initiative. It's been established with a globally unique approach to pursue research that highlights the complexity of international responses to conflicts and disasters, and the intersections between multi-dimensional health, socio-economic, and political aspects of complex emergencies. Since its establishment in 2016, HADRI, as we call it, has worked collaboratively with partners in Bangladesh, the Bangladeshi diaspora in Australia, and higher degree by research students from Bangladesh on a range of projects to increase knowledge about Bangladesh in Australia and to support academic capacity building of Bangladeshi researchers. The International Centre for Ocean Governance, ICOG, in our School of Law, has delivered multifaceted training to judges and judicial officials from Bangladesh through the capacity building of Law and Justice Division for Strengthening Subordinate Judiciary Management project. ICOG delivered training to more than 250 judges and judicial officials. The sculpture of Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman occupies a prominent place at the entrance to the International Centre for Ocean Governance. Appropriately given at the centre of our campus, he was the leader in South Asia to introduce legislation to safeguard the peaceful settlement of maritime disputes in the region. Our researchers are engaged in projects in Bangladesh, and our university hosts some 200 students from Bangladesh and normally recruits about 100 commencing each year. As some here would recall, the Bangladesh Prime Minister, the Honourable Sheikh Hasina Wazed, visited Western Sydney University in April of 2018. Australia and Bangladesh have a historically strong relationship. Australia was among the first to recognise the independence of Bangladesh in the 1970s. Within weeks of the Australian Prime Minister Whitlam's election in December of 1972, Australia provided material assistance to Bangladesh to support infrastructure recovery efforts and rebuild critical industries affected by the struggle for independence. In 1975, Prime Minister Whitlam visited Bangladesh and renewed the personal friendship he had formed with Prime Minister Sheikh Mujibur Rahman at the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in Ottawa, Canada, a few years prior. Mr. Whitlam described Prime Minister Sheikh Mujibur Rahman as belonging to, and I quote, that select band of men who have called a new nation into being and from its very birth embodied the social, political and spiritual traditions of its people and inspired their efforts and their sacrifices. We live in a time when this planet we share faces unprecedented existential challenges, and the need for good faith and political integrity, sound government and international cooperation have never been greater. Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman and the Honourable Gough Whitlam were both leaders who fully understood that prosperity, peace, and planetary well-being depend on nations working together. It is an opportune moment to come together to consider the example of visionary and courageous leadership that they exemplified. Thank you.
So thank you, Professor Glover, for opening in such an insightful way this wonderful Golden Jubilee event. I now want to introduce to the podium His Excellency Mohammed Sufia Rahman, who is the High Commissioner for the People's Republic of Bangladesh to Australia, New Zealand and Fiji. His Excellency has served as Ambassador to Myanmar, as High Commissioner to Sri Lanka as first secretary at the High Commission in New Delhi and was a member of the permanent mission to the United Nations in Geneva. He holds an MBA from the Institute of Business Administration at Dhaka University and a BSc in Civil Engineering from Bangladesh University of Engineering and Technology. Your Excellency, welcome.
Chair of the event of today, Professor Peter Shergold, Chancellor, Western Sydney University, Honorable Foreign Minister of Bangladesh, Dr. A.K. Abdul Momen, Professor Gareth Evans, longtime Australian Foreign Minister and international policymaker, Vice Chancellor of the Western Sydney University, Professor Bani Glover, Professor Imtiaz Ahmed, Professor Jenny Hocking, Mr. Kim Williams, distinguished speakers and panelists, dear participants, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, Shubho Bikel. Let me also begin by acknowledging the Daruk people, the traditional custodians of the land in which we are meeting this afternoon, and recognize their elders, past, present, and emerging. Ladies and gentlemen, Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, the dreamer and architect of independent Bangladesh, our father of the nation, was determined to creating a Sonar Bangla, literally a golden Bengal. By this, he meant a Bangladesh which would be free from exploitation, backwardness, prejudices, and where Bangladeshis will be in control of their own fate. He thus always asked for investment in people, in health, free and compulsory education, women's empowerment in particular. And he sought to dedicate resources to create human capital for the golden humans with productive hands and certainly liberal minds. Likewise, Prime Minister Whitlam created Medibank, the precursor of Medicare that we see today in Australia. He was the architect of free university education that unfortunately the successive Australian government couldn't maintain. He ensured federal funding for state schools in Australia that was finding it difficult to manage themselves. Whitlam's equal pay for women, social welfare reforms, reforms in pension system were certainly ahead of his time. He drafted legislation to grant land rights to indigenous people and thus uniting the country. Distinguished participants, Bangabandhu was a strong proponent of renunciation of the use of force in international relations. He was against war and was vehemently opposed to investing in machineries of war. Logically, he was against arms race in the time of Cold War and was a true believer of non-alignment. His concept of peace thus included campaign against racial discrimination, racism, apartheid, imperialism, and colonialism. He naturally stood for rightful claims of the people of Vietnam, Palestine, and South Africa. On the other hand, Labour's anti-war policy found the best articulation through Prime Minister Whitlam, who extricated Australia from the Vietnam War and abolished conscription. It is no surprise that Whitlam government let Australia out of its colonial rule over Papua New Guinea and granted it independence. This respect to the aspirations of PNG and the people of South Pacific was profound. Whitlam initiated engagement with China, more linkages with the neighborhood in the Asia Pacific. Ladies and gentlemen, constitutional crisis of November 1975, we will perhaps hear more from Professor Hocking, led to Australia losing the leader who had set in motion epoch-making reforms at lightning speed. 3 months earlier, the brutal killing of the Bangabandhu by forces of conspiracy brought to an abrupt end to his struggle to bring emancipation to the Bengali nation. And Bangladesh lost its path that we are trying to regain, and we have regained to a great extent under the leadership of present Prime Minister, the daughter of the legendary leader Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. These are some aspects that we find common in the two towering political personalities of the last century, which in my understanding, the historians and analysts ought to study further and in greater depth and detail. I would like to particularly thank Professor Barney Glover for accepting the idea of joint celebration of these two political giants, and the directors of the Whitlam Institute, Ms. Leanne Smith and Mr. Eric Sidoti, who nurtured this idea to the point of fruition of this afternoon. I fervently hope that the seminar will re-enliven memories of the two leaders and help us find solutions to many of the problems we face in the present day world and by our contemporary society. Study of Bangladesh, I was discussing with the Chancellor a few minutes before, the lifelong project of Bangabandhu. This is where his success lies. If Bangladesh is successful, it actually validates the project that he undertook amidst a lot of challenge. Is very well timely, as Bangladesh has been securing significant economic progress and social development in the recent time under the bold stewardship of Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina. Bangladesh is thus creating all kinds of opportunities for countries in the region and beyond. And that also includes Australia, and we see some reflection of that as Australia these years trying to find the value of Bangladesh and appreciating it. And Senator Mary Spain and Honorable Foreign Minister Abdul Momen are working tirelessly on that to create a new foundation for a true partnership between our two countries. It is satisfying that Australia is gradually appreciating the value of this resurgent Bangladesh as a key partner country, and it is timely for the academic institutions of Australia to overcome the deficit in the study and analysis of Bangladesh. We have just discussed this subject with Honorable Chancellor and the Vice Chancellor. Here we would expect the Western University, Sydney University to take lead, and I'm happy to report that we have had a general understanding to that effect. Let this seminar, ladies and gentlemen, begin a new chapter on overcoming the knowledge deficit of Bangladesh in Australia, and certainly on its great leader, the founder of Bangladesh, Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. I thank you all.
Well, thank you so much, Your Excellency. And as you've heard, we had an excellent meeting for about 45 minutes before we began today between the Vice Chancellor, myself, and the High Commissioner and the Consul General in Sydney. It is now my very great pleasure to welcome by video Dr. Abdul Momen, who has served as the Bangladesh Minister of Foreign Affairs since 2019. His appointment follows an esteemed career that traverses international diplomacy, high-level economic advisory roles, community development, and academia before he entered the Bangladesh Parliament in 2018. Dr. Momen has a PhD in economics and an MBA in business administration from Northeastern University in Boston. He's got an MPA in public administration, public policy, and international economics from Harvard, an LLB in law, an MA in development economics, and a BA honors from the University of Dhaka. He served as the Bangladesh Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary and was permanent representative to the UN from August in 2009 to November 2015. And during his time at the UN, he was called upon by the Secretary General to assist in a number of significant and sensitive roles. Equally important from my point of view, he has been actively engaged in social justice initiatives, including child labor and human trafficking over several decades. He now serves as the honorary president of the worldwide Bangabandhu Foundation. Please welcome Dr. Abdul Momen.
Thank you very much, Professor Shergold, Chancellor of Western Sydney University and Chair of today's seminar. Honorable Gareth Evans, AC, Distinguished Honorary Professor at the Australian National University and former Minister. His Excellency Ambassador Muhammad Rahman, High Commissioner of Bangladesh to Australia, Professor Bernie Glover, Vice Chancellor of Western Sydney University, keynote speaker, Professor Dr. Imtiaz Ahmed and Professor Jenny Hocking. Distinguished panelist, guest, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you. I am truly delighted that Western Sydney University, a leading Australian academic institution and a popular destination of Bangladeshi students, is hosting this seminar that will discuss the life and legacy of two political giants of Bangladesh and Australia. It is timely as we celebrate the birth centenary of the founding father of Bangladesh, Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, and the Golden Jubilee of Independence. I thank our High Commission in Canberra, Consulate General Sydney, and the Whitlam Institute in Western Sydney University for combining their efforts to organize this meaningful seminar today. I'm delighted to learn that a photo exhibition on Bangabandhu is also taking place parallel at the Whitlam Institute to display the eventful life of Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman through photography. I'm sure the visitors will find the exhibition invaluable. Distinguished participants, both Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman and Prime Minister Gough Whitlam were born visionaries and political thinkers who dedicated their lives in the service of their respective peoples. The celebration is also timely as we head towards the 50th anniversary of Bangladesh-Australia friendship, which is being reoriented, remodeled, and reinvigorated in many planes as active partners. It is heartening to note that the Australian academia and think tanks are equally appreciating the dynamism in bilateral relationship and doing their bit to create better understanding of our people, appreciation of our culture and tradition, values and principles that bind us as natural partners. Distinguished guest, Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman and Bangladesh are inseparable identities. Bangabandhu means friend of Bangladesh, a title that was conferred on him lovingly by the people of Bangladesh for his lifelong sacrifice for securing dignity of the people residing in Dhaka, East Pakistan, I mean the present Bangladesh. Isn't it poetic that his birth centenary coincided with the Golden Jubilee of the country that he dedicated his whole life for? At 50 years, we can claim more forcibly than ever before that the Sonar Bangla, the Golden Bengal, a prosperous Bangladesh that Bangabandhu dreamed of for the people of Bangladesh is finally in the making. Standing on his founding ideals of democracy, social justice, equality, and secularism, Bangladesh has turned the corner and rose from the ashes of war to become one of the fastest growing economies of the world under the able leadership of his daughter, Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina. Dear audience, Bangabandhu endured lifelong struggle to emancipate the people of Bangladesh, subjugated for centuries. Through decades of democratic movement, Bangabandhu successfully laid bare in front of the world the cultural, economic, and political deprivation that the people of then East Pakistan were subjugated to. Treatment of the Bengalis during Pakistan time was tantamount to colonial rules, imposed not by any external power, but by their own government. The landslide electoral victory by Bangabandhu's party, Awami League, in 1970s general election and rejection of the people's mandate by the ruling junta added a new dimension to the people's movement for an independent country under Bangabandhu's leadership. Here, I would like to give an example. In 1970s election, Bangabandhu's party, the Awami League, which is now in power, they secured 167 parliamentary seats out of 169 in then East Pakistan. And the whole of Pakistan, they secured the majority, single majority votes. But unfortunately, the military junta and the majority party of West Pakistan, known as People's Party, PPP of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, they conspired and did not allow Bangabandhu to govern the country. And that led to mass upsurge and leading to non-cooperation, and then, of course, the movement for independent Bangladesh. In his historic speech in Dhaka on 7th March 1971, Bangabandhu declared in a thunderous voice, while embracing the emotions and aspirations of the Bengalis, that I quote, "The struggle this time is for our freedom. The struggle this time is for independence," which was in essence a declaration of independence. Bangabandhu inspired the Bengali nation to break free the shackles of subordination and associated ignominy through a successful struggle over 9 months. People across the globe who were facing such internal colonialism in the post-colonial era after the Second World War did not have a voice until Bangabandhu gave them one. Till Bangladesh's birth, breakup of an independent country with a colonial past was considered unacceptable as a breach to the principle of territorial integrity. Fight for self-determination of a people facing injustice and exploitation has got wide acceptance. After the traumatic birth of Bangladesh in 1971, the then UN Secretary General unprecedentedly mentioned in his report to the UN General Assembly in late December 1971 that it was difficult for the UN to support territorial integrity of a member state which uses territory for grave human rights abuse. Bangabandhu's struggle for people's emancipation thus transcended Bangladesh's boundary and rewrote the international law to put people's right above everything else. He always stood for the deprived and he supported legitimate struggles waged by the Vietnamese and the Palestinians and laid the foundation of a value-based foreign policy for Bangladesh. Distinguished guest, in a world where re-emergence of sectarianism, colonialism, and ultra-nationalism are attempting to tear down the global fabric, leaders like Bangabandhu shine as the beacon of hope. Let me quote from his speech in Pakistan Constituent Assembly in Karachi in 1956, when the government was attempting to impose a religion-biased constitution on the people of then Pakistan. He said, and I quote, "We are all Pakistanis. Call everybody, every citizen, a Pakistani, irrespective of whether he is a Muslim, a Hindu, a Sheikh, Christian, or a Buddhist. Pakistan is for Pakistanis. Pakistan has not been formed for the Muslims alone," unquote. Fast forward to 1972, when once again Bangabandhu was speaking for secularism at the National Assembly during the adoption of the constitution of the newly independent Bangladesh. Here is what he said, he had to say, and I quote, "We will not stop practice of religion. Muslims will practice their religion. Hindus will practice their religion. Buddhists will practice their religion. Christians will practice their religion. will only object to political use of religion, unquote. This view of secularism is not only relevant for Bangladesh. This is partisan globally at a time we face religious extremism and communalism much more than earlier decades. This freedom-centric construct of secularism conceptualized by Bangabandhu holds the key to address the contemporary yet age-old issues of communal conflicts and also racial discrimination and ethnic disparities. As a part of its responsible global citizenry, Bangladesh is therefore trying to propagate the ideals of Bangabandhu across the globe. We firmly believe that Bangabandhu's messages of humanism, friendship, and peaceful coexistence have solutions to major conflicts of the contemporary times. Dear audience, the greatest Bengali of all time, Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, had been an ardent promoter of peace throughout his life. World peace had been one of the fundamental principles of his philosophy of life. He had always been with the oppressed, the exploited, and the peace-loving and freedom-loving people in any part of the world. Bangabandhu, in his maiden address at the UN General Assembly in 1974, declared, and I quote, "The noble ideals enshrined in the United Nations Charter are the very ideals for which millions of people have made the supreme sacrifice. The Bengali nation fully commits itself to the building of a world order in which the aspiration of all men for peace and justice will be realized." He further said that peace is imperative for survival of humankind. Following his principles, Bangladesh, he designed our foreign policy, the basic principle of which is friendship to all, malice towards none. Following his principles, Bangladesh has been a leader in the global peace. Currently, Bangladesh is the #1 in contributing UN peacekeepers in its various missions. Till today, Bangladesh has around 176,000 valiant men and women of Bangladesh has served the UN peacekeeping across the nations. Not only that, in addition that we would like to have sustainable peace across nations, Bangladesh Prime Minister proposed a resolution known as Culture of Peace. The basic element of culture of peace is to provide a sustainable peace across nations. In order to achieve sustainable peace across nations, the culture of peace proposes to inculcate a mindset of tolerance, a mindset of respect towards others, irrespective of religion, ethnicity, color, and race, so that our color is race, so that people can treat each other as human beings, not of some fractions. And if we can create such a mindset, and then we hope to have sustainable peace across nations. Recently in Bangladesh, on December 4th and 5th, Bangladesh organized World Peace Conference in order to develop a peaceful world, a sustainable peace across the nations. Ladies and gentlemen, former Prime Minister Gough Whitlam was known for his passion for a multicultural Australia. He introduced a raft of reforms that radically changed Australia's economic, legal, and cultural landscape. There are striking similarities between the legacies of Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman and Prime Minister Whitlam. Both had only about 3 years stint as the heads of their governments, yet both were successful in deciding changing the trajectory of their countries to achieve social justice, political inclusion, and people's empowerment. I'm sure the scholarly discussions that are about to take place in today's seminar will highlight their views and ideals and ideas and discuss relevance of them in the contemporary world. I thank you all. Joy Bangla, Joy Bangabandhu. May Bangladesh live live forever. May the relationship between Australia and Bangladesh live forever. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Momen, for that wide-ranging address. I'm now going to introduce Professor the Honourable Gareth Evans, Distinguished Honorary Professor at the Australian National University, where he was a very forceful and engaged Chancellor from 2010 to 2019. Gareth Evans, of course, was a Cabinet Minister in both the Hawke and Keating Labor governments from 1983 to 96, and from 88 to 96 was Foreign Minister. And then from 2000 to 2009, he was the President and CEO of the Brussels-based International Crisis Group, the Independent Global Conflict Prevention and Resolution Organization. He's written or edited 13 books. He's got honorary doctorates from around the world. He's taught at many universities, including Oxford and Cambridge and Princeton and Yale and Stanford. He's co-chaired 2 major international commissions, one on intervention and state sovereignty, that was in 2000 and 2001, and the second on nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament, and that was from 2008 to 2010. He currently co-chairs the International Advisory Board of the New York-based Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect. He's chair of the Asia-Pacific Leadership Network for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, and is on the advisory board of the ANU Center for Asian-Australian Leadership. Gareth Evans was made a Companion of the Order of Australia in 2012. And amongst his other awards in 2016, he was awarded the Sir Edward Weary Dunlop Asia Link Medal for long-term commitment to improving Australia-Asia relations.
It's many years now since I had the honour of being Australia's Foreign Minister and the privilege in that capacity of visiting Bangladesh. But I'm very pleased now to have been given this opportunity to join with you in celebrating the 50th anniversary of the independence of this country, whose culture and people and enormous strength and resilience in the face of adversity I've always deeply admired and respected. It's particularly appropriate that this commemorative event should be hosted by Western Sydney University's Whitlam Institute, in association, of course, with the Bangladesh High Commission and Consulate General in Sydney. Not only does Gough Whitlam remain the only Australian Prime Minister to have visited Bangladesh, he was clearly the driving force as Opposition Leader and then Prime Minister behind Australia's very early recognition of the new state in January 1972, the 4th in the world, the very first Western country to do so, and also the driving force behind Bangladesh's very early accession to membership of the Commonwealth, United Nations, and other international organisations. Being as well-travelled as he was, as well-read as he was, and as deeply interested in the currents of global and regional history as he was, Gough Whitlam was acutely aware of all the factors that drove the independence movement and which made Bangabandhu, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, whose legacy this event is particularly commemorating, the figure of towering importance that he was. Whitlam understood the richness and depth of Bengali culture, particularly but not only exemplified in the writings of Rabindranath Tagore. He understood the deep attachment Bengalis have to the Bangla language and the hurt caused by the West Pakistan's elite's failure to recognize that. He understood the extent of the discrimination and exclusion that those living in the East had in so many other ways suffered since the creation of Pakistan in 1947. He understood the suffering caused by the Yahya Khan government's totally inadequate response to the catastrophic 1970 cyclone and the rage that was provoked by the failure to convene the National Assembly when Sheikh Mujibur Rahman's Awami League won enough seats in the December 1970 election to entitle it to govern. And above all, Whitlam understood, was appalled by, and spoke out strongly against, notwithstanding the reflex support by the United States at the time for Pakistan against India, the horrific scale of the atrocities that were perpetrated by the Pakistan military when it initiated Operation Searchlight in March 1971. The mass murder of intellectuals and supporters or assumed supporters of independence, the mass rape of Bengali women, and all the unconscionable violence and repression which caused nearly 10 million Bengalis to flee to India. All of which, of course, triggered the war between India and Pakistan, the crushing defeat which followed of the occupying forces by India and the National Liberation Army, and the achievement of independence in December 1971 that we're celebrating today. The links of understanding and support forged between Gough Whitlam and Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, consolidated by our early establishment of a resident mission in Dhaka headed by a Bangla-speaking High Commissioner, did ensure that bilateral relations between Australia and Bangladesh got off to a flying start. And they've continued to be strong and mutually respectful since, mainly focused on development and trade, but with a growing interest in security issues as the regional geopolitical environment does become more volatile and uncertain. The relationship has had to weather some severe internal stresses in Bangladesh, not least those following the terrible assassination of Bangabandhu in 1975. But Bangladesh's consolidation of its secular, generally religiously tolerant parliamentary democracy has ensured a firm foundation for our present and future relationship. I'm not sure that Australia on our side has done as much as we could and should have in recent years to support Bangladesh in some of the extraordinary challenges the country has had to face, including housing and feeding and keeping secure and trying to resettle the huge influx of Rohingya refugees fleeing Myanmar, military oppression, but also, of course, coping with the huge ongoing vulnerability to climate change and extreme weather events posed by the country's low-lying geography. My hope is that this anniversary event, reminding us of our shared experience and commitment in the past, will trigger a more intense engagement in the future, and one based particularly on people-to-people links, of the kind being forged here at Western Sydney University, with its very strong cohort of Bangladeshi students and the judicial training program of the law school. My own decades of experience in international affairs have taught me that what matters most in making our region and the wider world safer, saner, more prosperous and just is recognizing through close personal interaction the reality of our common humanity. That for all our differences of ethnicity and culture and life experience, what we have in common is our status as living, breathing, feeling human beings. In that context, I think my most memorable experience during my own visit to Dhaka as Foreign Minister back in 1990, during the period under President Ershad, just before parliamentary democracy reasserted itself, my most memorable experience then had really nothing to do with all the high-level discussions and high-level official meetings, but rather a visit I paid to a hospital being supported by an Australian aid program and focusing particularly on life-threatening gastrointestinal diseases. Seeing, as I did, a ward full of suffering babies and young children, seeing the heartrending anxiety of their parents, and seeing the care and compassion so evident in the doctors and the nurses trying to save those kids was a deeply moving experience, and one that I've never forgotten. It's the human dimension that matters. It was that human dimension, and not the often cynical demands of geopolitics, that led Gough Whitlam to respond as he did to the plight of the Bengali people and the inspired leadership of Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman during that tumultuous pre-independence period. And it's the human dimension, encouraged by events like this, that will ensure that the relationship between our two countries will grow in the future ever stronger. Thank you, and have a great discussion.
I now want to welcome via Zoom Dr. Imtiaz Ahmed, who is the Professor of International Relations in the Department of International Relations at Dhaka University. He is Director of the University Centre for Genocide Studies. Dr. Ahmed is also currently the Visiting Professor at Sarjes University in Beirut and Taylor's University in Kuala Lumpur. He's authored or co-authored and edited no less than 34 books, 13 monographs, published more than 120 research papers and scholarly articles. He's an alumnus of the Australian National University, which is, of course, where Professor Evans now resides. And that is in addition to his studies in Bangladesh and Canada. Dr. Ahmed heads several national and international projects on mass violence, on violent extremism, and on the Rohingya crisis. He joins us today by Zoom. Welcome, Dr. Ahmed.
Let me start by saying good earth to all of you, given the time difference. And it's quite, I guess, an opportunity for me to return to Australia, virtually though. But when I was asked to speak to this particular audience, I said, lovely, because that would help me, think about my days in Australia also. The topic that I was given was Bangabandhu's political ideology and the contemporary world. And I have little, given the time, given to me, I have some 22 slides to go through quickly to give a sense of the person and, of course, of Bangladesh and a little bit with the contemporary world to give the relationship between Bangabandhu and the contemporary world. Let me shift, yeah. Okay, father of the nation, 55 years, keep that in mind. He didn't have, Mr. Whitlam had longer days, though shorter in the government, but 98 years. But here we have a person living only for 55 years. So we need to look how intense that 55 years was. Now, to get an understanding of his political ideology, best is to look into our constitution and get the 4 principles, which is what I think in overall his political ideology is. Nationalism, of course, based on language, socialism, but more understanding from freedom from exploitation, democracy, more understood from the rights of the disempowered, not the rights of the empowered. Human rights can have different meaning. And of course, when it comes to secularism, it's freedom of all religions. So this is basically, the political ideology, if we can put it in one slide. But let me unpack his ideology and, of course, the 4 components of this particular slide to give you a sense where he got his understanding, what was the foundation, what led him to do what he did, and what were his thoughts about the future of Bangladesh.
Professor Ahmed, just let me hold you for a moment because I don't think we're getting the slides that you're putting up. We've still got the introductory slides. So let me just.
Oh, okay. Maybe then I go. Okay. Okay. Let me stop sharing and come back again. I think there may be some. Let me. Okay. Just give me a second. Give me a second.
Right. Just then we were right.
Does it work now?
Yeah, we've now got one that's headed The Power of the Republic.
Okay, let me change this one and see whether, can you see the next one?
Yes, and now we're on
Okay.
democratic history.
Okay, now I think. Okay, so I started with this Bangabandhu's political ideology, nationalism, socialism, understood more from the point of view of freedom from exploitation, human rights and democracy more understood from the disempowered, and of course, freedom, religion, freedom for all. Now, to get a sense of that, the best is to go a little bit into history and to see what Bengal is all about. Bangladesh is a new country, but is a very part of a very old civilization. We had republic way back in the 6th century BC, the Lichavi Republic. Scholars are now pointing out it's older than Greek republics. So republicanism is not something that has come new to us via the British colonialism. Its basis, it has a longer basis. Not to mention, we should not also forget the Pal dynasty. The first king was also elected Raja. And the system was that the Maharaja gets elected by small kings. And that was the idea. So you have 400 years of what could be called a Buddhist regime in Bengal. And from there, we come to 71 People's Republic of Bangladesh. So the idea of having republicanism is pretty old. Now, this all ended in the 18th century. Bengal had a very tragic history. Back in the 18th century, globally, China was the largest economy in the world in the 18th century. Undivided India was the second largest economy in the world. And in that undivided India, Bengal was the richest province. Now, from that richest province, it ended up in famine in 1943. And I don't have to tell you the reason, but if you visit a British Museum in London, you'll get an idea of what happened to Bengal. And I guess Churchill's man-made famine made it worse. So this is the tragedy that went it literally got Bengal or got Bangladesh to the kind of underdevelopment that we had for many years. Now, it was not only the looting of Bengal, but Bengal also suffered a cartographical massacre. And when we talk of Bengal, we actually mean Greater Bengal, that is Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. They were all together. And that was what Bengal was all about, or Greater Bengal was all about. It got cartographically massacred, first in 1905 and then in 1911. And the interesting part of that cartographical massacre was this particular statement in 1904 by Mr. Risley, who was the Home Secretary, writing to Lord Curzon, who was the Viceroy, saying, Bengal united is a power, Bengal divided will pull in several different ways. And that is precisely what happened. No, they were terrified with Bengal. Keep in mind that the British entered through the Bengal, but the Bengal, or the people of Bengal, were the first to revolt against colonialism. Now, very quickly, the cartographical massacre did not end there. In 1947, we had another massacre of Bengal, and that was Bengal divided into East Pakistan and West Bengal. Now, out of that cartographical massacre and underdevelopment, you can see the first genocidal partition of 1947, where over 1 million killed. That also did not end with the story. 1971, we had again a genocidal partition where 3 million people were killed. So a country or a land or a people which face two genocide almost in the lifetime for some, you can well imagine that Bangladesh really was in a rough roller coaster ride. But then out of this history came three exceptionalities, I would say. The first exceptionality was Bangladesh is the only People's Republic in South Asia. There are altogether 5 People's Republic in the world now. There were many earlier, but only 5 now. The oldest one is North Korea. Then China is the People's Republic. And then Algeria became People's Republic, and then Laos. And finally, Bangladesh is also a People's Republic. And that's the distinction when we, as a South Asian country, this is the only People's Republic. And one of the reasons of that People's Republic is the second exceptionality. Bangladesh is the only country in South Asia which fought a liberation war. when we say we fought a liberation war, it means we literally fought a liberation war where the security forces and the civil society got together. Myself, I was just a class 9 student, but I left my parents and went to Agartala, went to India, literally slept on the pavement and had an experience or an education. And I always tell my students that the greatest education that I had was in 1971 as a class 9 student. And that exceptionality is also very important when we talk about Bangladesh. And the third exceptionality has already been flagged, and that is the foreign policy principle of Bangladesh, the friendship to all, malice towards none. Keep in mind that this was not a principle that came after independence of Bangladesh. It came before the liberation, before even Bangladesh went through this independence struggle. It was mentioned in the June 1970 election manifesto of Awami League under the leadership of Bangabandhu. And keep in mind, this was a Cold War period with Soviet Union and the United States, and Pakistan was a member of SEATO and CENTO. Even then, Bangabandhu and his party flagged in the election manifesto that friendship to all and malice towards none. And that is the principle that he reiterated after independence in 1973 in a big way during the Asian World Peace Conference. But look at his statement in 6 February 1972. This was the first visit. He came back from Pakistan. He was, as you will know, he was in prison in Pakistan. He came back on 10th January. He goes to Kolkata to, to thank the Indians. And on 6 February 1972, not even a month after he came back, he tells to the whole, and this was in, to the Prime Minister of Indira Gandhi, he's telling everyone to get together. And this is an interesting statement. And let me read a little bit from there. He says, "It is my earnest hope that there will at last be peace and stability in the subcontinent." And then he goes on to say, "Let there be an end once for all to the sterile policy of confrontation between neighbors." Now that's incredible, particularly a country which came out of a genocide and literally mass killing at the hands of Pakistan, going to India, telling even to the Prime Minister that all the countries of South Asia ought to work together, because if we don't stop fighting, then we can't bring peace. So that shows that he did not, move away from the vision that he had. Now that brings to Mr. Whitlam's visit to Bangladesh-Australia friendship. If you can look at his statement, Bangabandhu's statement on 19th January 1975, and I'll read out a little bit to give you a sense. And this is what Bangabandhu, the statement that he read out in front of Prime Minister Whitlam. And I'm quoting Bangabandhu: "The people of Bangladesh have always held the people of Australia and the great leaders in high esteem and admiration. The people of Bangladesh received much sympathy and support from Australia during those dark days of 1971, when the nation was engaged in grim struggle for survival. Australia is not only a great country endowed with vast natural resources, its people are also known well for their energy, creativity, and Australian spirit. I am indeed proud to welcome you today on the soil of independent, sovereign Bangladesh." And then he goes on to say, "We are aware of the great changes you have brought about in Australia's relations with the nations of Asia and the Pacific region. The most significant of these changes is the recognition that Australia's future, its well-being and prosperity is linked inextricably with its neighbors and countries of Asian region." I think this is absolutely central to what Bangabandhu thought of Mr. Whitlam's contribution. And then he ends by saying that let me read out the last statement. "Like Australia, Bangladesh is a peace-loving nation. It is therefore only natural that together with other littoral states, we have supported the concept of the Indian Ocean area as a zone of peace." And then he goes on to say that Australia has also supported the idea of zone of peace, and that it will remain free from great power rivalries. So you can see the sense of what Bangabandhu was trying to tell to the world of how important peace is and how important that we need to shun the rivalry. Now, out of his vision, actually, and I come to the contemporary world, out of vision, and this has already been flagged by the Honorable Foreign Minister, the 50 years of independence, if you see the key numbers and see how the difference that Bangladesh has made from 71 to 2021, whether in terms of GDP, per capita, life expectancy, you can go on and on. So it's not only on the human development, not only on the GDP, but also on the human development index. There has been enormous kind of a journey for Bangladesh, particularly if you look into some of the South Asian countries, and this would help you to get a sense. If you look at the life expectancy at birth, we are almost catching up China, which has 76.3, and Bangladesh is already 73, actually, the life expectancy. This is a little bit old, and we have crossed India and Pakistan. So if you look at the human development indicators, even in infant mortality rate, you will see how Bangladesh has worked hard. And here I have to say that in Bangladesh, the GO and NGO partnership has worked in a way which probably other countries in South Asia could not replicate, and therefore probably had a kind of a slower development when it comes to human development index. Now, if you look at the GDP growth index, which has already been referred to, pre-pandemic, it was really high. And then even with the pandemic, we have managed pretty well so far. We don't know whether the next wave will hit us hard or not. But overall, I think we have done pretty well. Now, if you look at the pandemic, the world has, gone in a different direction. A vaccine probably would be an important element, and then the pitfalls of vaccine nationalism. You can see also a little bit of what I would say, intra-Quad misgivings. And there are probably good reasons for it. And that is, we are once again into geopolitical competitions. China, with BRI versus Indo-Pacific Alliance, the Quad, the Build Better World Partnership, and of course, what I refer to now, currently the Triad, rather than using the other word. I think Quad has already transformed into Triad, and that shows how the geopolitical competitions are really heating up this part of the region. But Bangladesh looks into more favorably into the incommensurable strategies, because when you look at the BRI, it's more on the traditional infrastructure, whereas when you look at the non-traditional, the Build Better partnership, you can see the non-traditional infrastructure. You can give me just give me a second. Hello. Oh, sorry for that. You can hear now. Sorry. So you can see the non-traditional infrastructure is climate health, digital technology, and so we look into the incumbency strategy, and we think that we can, in fact, have a relationship with both. And this is where Bangladesh makes a difference, or already made a difference, is development without enmity. We are members of all the organizations you can think about, whether it's SARC, BIMSTEC, BBIN, which is Bangladesh, Bhutan, and India. Then also BISIM, Bangladesh, China, India, and Myanmar, the Indo-Pacific Alliance, the BRI, and also, of course, the Build Back Better. And it's a development without enmity. Bangladesh literally does not have enemies. Myanmar is trying very hard with the Rohingya case to make us enemy, but still with Myanmar, we have a very good relationship. We still have trading relationship. We don't consider Myanmar as an enemy, because the problem that they have with Rohingya, it is their problem. It is their people, not something that will make, we don't look at them as enemies. That's the point I'm making. And this, my last slide, last two slides, this is where Bangabandhu comes back. This is the culture of peace that has already been referred to. He was against war. He was against arms race. he was against colonialism, he was against racism, mainly to build South Asia, at least South Asia, as an area of peace. And let me read out the concluding remarks that I have, and let me read out to give you a little bit of sense. Leaders go through ups and downs in their life, just like ordinary citizens. But what distinguishes leaders from ordinary citizens is the vision that they inculcate in the people's minds. Mujib is an extraordinary example of such leadership. But in the case of Mujib, there is more to it. The state of Pakistan incarcerated him for more than 12 years, yet it failed to arrest his vision and the perseverance to attain it. Even when Bangladesh was in a dire situation, Bangabandhu reminded the world about the resolve of the people to live in freedom and with dignity as free citizens of a free country, and the thirst for a better future. The younger generation of people, both within the country and outside, can certainly take a cue from it and engage themselves in contemporizing and making Bangabandhu's Sonar Bangla, or Golden Bengal, a reality. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for that wonderful address. I'm glad we got all the PowerPoints, and it was lovely to have that moment of family authenticity included in it. Now, I want to introduce now Dr. Jenny Hocking. Jenny Hocking is the Emeritus Professor at Monash and, of course, is the Whitlam Institute's inaugural Distinguished Fellow. She is an award-winning historian, renowned for her works of Australian political history. That includes biographies of former Attorney General and High Court Justice Lionel Murphy, and of author and activist Frank Hardy. But most importantly for today, she is the preeminent Whitlam scholar. Her 2-volume biography of Gough Whitlam, Gough Whitlam, His Time, and Gough Whitlam, A Moment in History, reveals her forensic approach and her capacity to deal with the historical narrative. And of course, both of those strengths proved to be essential in her landmark documentation and then subsequent High Court victory to ensure public access to the palace letters. In other words, to look at the correspondence between the then Governor General, Sir John Kerr, and the monarchy. And that saga was captured in her latest book, published in 2020, which was called The Palace Letters, the Queen, the Governor General, and the Plot to Dismiss Gough Whitlam. Dr. Jenny Hocking.
Thank you very much, Chancellor Professor Peter Shergold, Vice-Chancellor Professor Barney Glover, High Commissioner His Excellency Muhammad Sufiur Rahman, Foreign Minister the Honourable Dr. A.K. Abdul Momen, Kandakar Masood Al-Alam, Consul General, Professor Gareth Evans, Professor Dr. Imtiaz Ahmed, distinguished guests, members of the Whitlam family and friends. It is a very great honour to speak to you today, and I would like firstly to respectfully acknowledge the exceptional figure of Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, father of the nation of Bangladesh, and to thank you for inviting me to be part of this celebration of such a significant time in your nation's history. 49 years ago, Gough Whitlam came to office as Australia's 21st Prime Minister, with the most comprehensive reform agenda this country has ever known. After 23 years of uninspired, tired, Conservative government, there were so many wrongs to be righted, as Whitlam's great friend and colleague, Don Dunstan, recalled. There were so many inequities, he said, inequalities, unfairnesses within the community, the position of Aborigines, the position of women, the position of minority groups, the lack of anti-discrimination legislation. All of those things needed to be done, and we saw a great opportunity. Gough Whitlam took up that challenge with an inspiring program for change that encompassed every facet of Australian life and beyond. His government shook us from the torpor and complacency of decades of political inertia, the blindness to injustice at home and abroad that had stunted the Australian political imagination for so long. Whitlam had the vision to imagine a different future for Australia as an independent, open, and tolerant society. He had the determination to plan for it, and he had the leadership to make it happen. This was an expansive program for change in which the local and the international melded together in a national transformation that did not end at Australia's borders. In government, Whitlam oversaw a myriad of domestic initiatives, and we've heard of some of them already, from regionalism to urban renewal, universal sewerage, as well as universal health insurance, equal pay, no-fault divorce, free tertiary education, an end to the White Australia policy, an Australian national anthem, votes for 18-year-olds, the Racial Discrimination Act, and Aboriginal land rights. Together, they created modern Australia. While Whitlam's 3 years in government were transformative at home, they also marked a defining shift from the attitudes of the past and the insular, Anglo-centric stance of the post-war years. Whitlam's breadth of policy, his way of thinking about Australia's place in the world and in our region, shaped the way we think of ourselves as a nation today. Every government since has not only walked in that shadow, they have built on it. As former High Court Justice Michael Kirby said in his lecture on Whitlam's internationalism here at the Whitlam Institute, after Whitlam, there would be political differences of degree and emphasis in the international sphere, but never again would Australia revert to isolationism or indifference and disdain for the world beyond our continental borders. This was one of Whitlam's most significant and enduring legacies. He revitalised Australia's engagement with the international community and with the nations of our region in a way that no previous government had even contemplated. He saw this as a shared experience, an interlocking commitment, which he expressed in the 1972 It's Time policy speech in this way. We have a new chance for our nation. We can recreate this nation. We have a new chance for our region. We can help recreate this region. Soon after coming to office, Whitlam articulated this new foreign policy position as a more independent Australian stance in international affairs, an Australia which will be less militarily oriented and not open to suggestions of racism, an Australia which will enjoy a growing standing as a distinctive, tolerant, cooperative and well-regarded nation, not only in the Asian and Pacific regions, but in the world at large. Gough Whitlam embraced the reality of Australia's place in the region, seeing in it an opportunity for Australia to play a leading role in promoting self-determination, international cooperation, and peaceful coexistence. My great hope for my government, he said, is that it will see the end of the old inhibitions, the self-defeating fears about Australia's place in the world, and the beginning of a creative maturity. It was a stark contrast to the fear, ignorance, and belligerence which had characterised the previous decades. Whitlam's world stage was one in which Australia, as an independent nation, subservient to neither Britain nor America, could itself be a driver of international action, favouring no one nation above others and meeting Australia's own interests, not others. This was at base a matter of equality, a rejection of special treatment for some nations, but always within a framework of alignment with the West rather than a radical realignment. He said, we are very properly aiming to draw our own conclusions and express them in international gatherings. We will no longer wait for a tip or a clearance from Britain or America. Britain's or America's interests may not always coincide with ours. So while acknowledging those traditional alliances, Whitlam no longer turned away from Australia's place in the Asia-Pacific region. Australia would treat its relations with all nations equally rather than privileging relations with its two traditional allies. In this formulation, alliance did not mean compliance. The American President, Richard Nixon, was shocked, telling his Secretary of State, Dr. Henry Kissinger, Australia's treating the US on a par with other nations. The changing foreign policy priorities were reflected in the first official international visitor to call on Whitlam. It was the Chief Minister of Papua New Guinea, Michael Samarak. Together, they finalised a timetable for independence, an end to Australia's remaining colonial trustee relationship, and a pathway to achieve it within 3 years, which they did. The carefully constructed order of Whitlam's own international visits also reflected the government's new focus towards the Asia-Pacific region. Rather than the usual prime ministerial priority pilgrimage to the United Kingdom or the United States, Gough Whitlam's first visit was to New Zealand. His second was to Papua New Guinea, and his third was to Indonesia. He didn't get to England for 2 years after his election, which was a statement in itself. On his arrival in London, he defiantly stressed Australia's new outlook as a moment of national self-assertion and maturity. "We have grown up," he said. "Since my government was elected, it has pursued a new course in its foreign affairs. We have sought a more distinctive and independent role for Australia, especially in our own region." Increasing Australian aid was central to this foreign policy reorientation. The Whitlam government established the Australian Development Assistance Agency as Australia's first dedicated aid agency, and expenditure increased significantly. Aid to Bangladesh increased 6-fold during that time. If a single episode exemplified the gulf between the old and the new, it was Whitlam's inspired and politically perilous decision as opposition leader to head a Labor Party delegation to Communist China. As Whitlam met Premier Zhou Enlai with 40 Chinese officials and intense international media interest, the Australian Prime Minister, Billy McMahon, mocked him as the Manchurian candidate and said he was being played like a trout by China and an impertinence to the leader of the United States. Unfortunately for McMahon, Henry Kissinger was in fact arriving in Beijing just as Whitlam was leaving to arrange the US President Richard Nixon's own historic visit to China. The dramatic contrast between Whitlam's far-sighted agenda, his courage and composure in taking that chance, and McMahon's rigid conservatism cemented Whitlam's stature as an international leader before he had even come to office. In forging an independent policy direction, Whitlam chose engagement instead of denial. His aim, as he described it, was to seek security with Asia, not security from Asia. He was a pragmatist, a realist, under whose leadership Australia would no longer deny its geography because of its history. In this way, and certainly as Whitlam himself considered it, Australia's reorientation was simply the ratification of the new reality. This was a fundamental and long-held view, one that Whitlam had worked towards from opposition and which he believed in strongly as both a personal and a political imperative. It was a view he shared with his father, Fred Whitlam, the highly respected Commonwealth Crown Solicitor and Australia's representative on the UN's Commission on Human Rights in the 1950s, and who, like his son, was a fervent internationalist. Whitlam's internationalism reflected the confluence of his unusual breadth of knowledge, a deep intellectual commitment, and to an important and often overlooked extent, his own wartime experience. His 4 years as Air Force navigator in the Pacific had made him acutely aware of the proximity of our closest regional neighbours, a matter of only a few hours flying time away, which had nevertheless been all but ignored and to which most Australians had little connection. I was convinced the European as well as the Japanese empires in the Pacific and Indian Oceans had no future, Whitlam said. And that certainly gave me the idea that we had to work towards the end of colonialism in the Pacific and Indian Oceans. That gave me an insight which nobody in the Parliament had so well. And on that, he was absolutely right. No other parliamentarian in Australia shared that particular experience. That wartime experience cemented in Gough Whitlam an international outlook, a sense of Australia as a contributor to world developments, and it fueled his deep commitment to national self-determination and an end to colonialism everywhere. As leader of the opposition, Whitlam had been alert to the ravages of the War of Liberation in Bangladesh and had urged the McMahon government to recognise the newly independent nation in 1971. With that bipartisan support, Australia was one of the first countries to recognise Bangladesh early the next year. But Whitlam's support didn't stop at Australia's own recognition. While still leader of the opposition, he lobbied strongly for Bangladesh to be recognised by the Commonwealth, raising this with the British Prime Minister Edward Heath during a visit to London in 1972. Since Australia is one of the nearest Commonwealth countries to Bangladesh, he said it should be giving some leadership to other Commonwealth nations over recognition. Bangladesh was formally welcomed to the Commonwealth at the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in 1973. It was at this meeting that the two men whose lives we commemorate today, Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman and Gough Whitlam, first met. It led to a developing friendship between both countries and their leaders. Whitlam then advocated for the admission of Bangladesh to the United Nations, which came in 1974. And the following year, he made a state visit to Bangladesh at the invitation of Prime Minister Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. Whitlam was accompanied by a high-powered delegation, including ministers and departmental secretaries, among other senior government officials. Gough Whitlam's state visit was the first and so far the only visit by an Australian Prime Minister to Bangladesh. Let me end today with Gough Whitlam's own words from his speech at the state banquet in Dhaka during that visit, words of respect for the Prime Minister, Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, and Bangladesh. You, Prime Minister, belong to that select band of men who, we've already heard that quote, so I won't say that one again. Our affection for your country and its people has been deep and continuing. Australia followed with close interest and deep concern the tragic events that led to the birth of your nation. Your long road to independence was paved with suffering of an appalling kind. Your struggle and your ultimate victory were made possible by inspired leadership, by the resolution of your people, by their determination to achieve the goals of freedom and respect for their culture and language. Bangladesh has no firmer friend than Australia. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor Hocking. I think you will all agree that we could have not had a better opening to this important forum today from such a distinguished group of speakers from Bangladesh and Australia. And now, Professor Glover, I am going to pass to you to chair and moderate a panel discussion. I'll hand over.
Yes, I think we're now turned on. Thank you, Chancellor, for those words. Thank you, Professor Hocking, for that presentation, and to Professor Ahmed. That was two very important and stimulating presentations, and I'm sure our panel members that are with me will remark shortly in relation to that and some other questions that we might pose to you. But I'd like to introduce our panel members to begin with. First of all, Professor Rafakul Islam, who is beside me, Emeritus Professor of Law at Macquarie University, retired recently, but still very active, spanning a career of over 45 years as a law academic and researcher at Macquarie. Also, of course, a period of time at the University of Rajshahi in Bangladesh, as well as the Department of Law at the University of Papua New Guinea, someone with a deep interest in our region. So thank you for joining us, Professor Islam. Dr. Neera Rahman, welcome to Dr. Rahman, an academic in arts, teaching innovation in the Faculty of Arts at the University of Melbourne, specialist in the scholarship of teaching and learning, designing, developing, implementing and evaluating innovations in arts curricula and pedagogy. And Dr. Rahman works towards a more inclusive, applicable, transformative and internationalized, importantly for this conversation, arts and humanities education. And I know you have particular interests in co-creation in higher education, the student voice and agency, student employability, and articulating transferable humanities skills, intercultural communication and other competencies. So welcome to Dr. Rahman. Kim Williams AM, beside me here, a great friend of the university, has a long involvement in the arts, in entertainment and the media industries here in Australia and overseas, including as Chief Executive at News Corp Australia, Foxtel, Fox Studios Australia, the Australian Film Commission, Southern Star Entertainment, and also as a Senior Executive at the ABC, has held many, many board positions. This section is not long enough to give the bio of the people on this panel. Just as Kim was appointed as a member of the Order of Australia in 2006 for services to the arts and public policy formulation in the film and television industry, and in October 2009 awarded a Doctor of Letters honoris causa by Macquarie University, and he's now a member of the board of the Whitlam Institute. Please welcome Kim Williams. Mac Williams is our final panel member, a former senior diplomat, a long career in Asia and Canberra, in almost 40 years in the diplomatic service, including as High Commissioner in Bangladesh, 1980 to 1982, Mac, Ambassador in the Philippines and in the Republic of Korea, many senior positions in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and in the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, attended the Royal College of Defence Studies in London in the 1970s. Since returning to Sydney, he's pursued interests in business and the wider community, retaining very close links with Asia, especially Korea. Chairman of the UTS InSearch and the Cooperative Research Centre for Environmental Biotech, amongst many other things. Please welcome Mac Williams. So we have a great panel, but not enough time to do justice to the topic at hand. People might like to put forward questions from the audience, so please consider questions you might like to put to our panel. But I want to start with you, Mac. 1980 to 1982, barely a decade after the election of the Whitlam government and the tumultuous events of independence in Bangladesh. So what is your recollection of that moment in relation to the new nation of Bangladesh and Australia's relationship with it?
Can you hear me? I'm not sure whether it's...
Yes, it is.
Okay. Well, first of all, I have to say, as it was my first ambassadorship, it's always got a special place in my house. But no, a couple of critical things, I think, is that when we were in Bangladesh, people still were very fresh in their minds about the division. For example, my wife, her first job in Australia was working for the Pakistan Trade Commissioner in Sydney, who was a Bengali. And her contact with his family was a very tragic one when we went to Dhaka, because he had disappeared. And so we had straight away a personal connection of the relationship. To go the other way around, I think I was very impressed with the slides which our Dhaka professor provided, because that was the one thing for me I think I can say is this was a country, when we were there, it's half the size and population of what it is today, but it was in desperate situation. And when I came to write my valedictory dispatch, the dispatch at the end of my posting, I started off by saying, there are no more adjectives I can use. Everyone before me has talked about the population problem, about the lack of resources, about the inequity and all sorts of things. I just pray that Bangladesh will find their way through. And what a wonderful thing it is today to see on the slides here, Bangladesh has played its way through. That's the first one, I think. The second was that I used to enjoy going to talk to the president of University of Dhaka. Those of you who know Bangladesh and all our Bengali friends know that. It's also the graffiti capital of the world. And the absolute walls of the University of Dhaka are always inscribed with huge graffiti. And I recall one day sitting in the garden, he had a rose garden at the president of the University of Dhaka, and a bunch of students came walking through, marched past us, walked through his house, walked up to the bedrooms, came down again and out again. I said to him, what's going on? He said, this is Dhaka. can't get the police in because that causes a problem. So we just have to live with it. And I thought, what a wonderful, equitable way to be, someone who can actually stay there and say that. The other thing I think important to say is what Gareth Evans had to say, is that relationships really depend on much more than the written academic studies. Relationships are such a personal thing. And there are two pieces of relationship which stick in my mind particularly. One of them, and it's very apposite today, is cricket. I was impressed by the way that all the Bangladeshis we met in Dhaka supported Australia in cricket against England and of course against India. And so they would listen to their radios to the test matches. And I thought, this is extraordinary. We've got this contact with Bangladesh, which is like that. So one of the great things we were able to achieve among a few was to say, what could we do to help cricket in Bangladesh? And I happened to talk to someone who had been in Calcutta when Australia had provided the first curator for the Calcutta Stadium to put in a good pitch, give some good pitches so you can play good cricket. So we actually got a curator up to Dhaka. And in those days, the High Commission was located in the Bhubani Hotel. And from my window, I looked out over the Baitul Bukaram and the cricket stadium and all of that. So cricket, I think, is something which has brought us together. And now in the recent visit, Australian team was thrashed by Bangladesh in Dhaka, which I thought was very timely. The second thing I'd mention is, which is also quite timely, but Australia's first export of coal was to Bengal. It was to Calcutta and to Dhaka. And that came from Newcastle, where it had been collected by hand from Nobby's Head in 1799. 150 tons of Australian coal, our first ever export, went to Bangladesh. That's for historians a piece of trivia. It's good to know, but that's a connection. So, but I should let others talk.
Thank you, Mac. No, appreciate those insights and great history. Perhaps to go and follow on from our two presentations, particularly from Professor Hocking and obviously Dr. Ahmed, but first of all to you, Dr. Rahman, I know that you've written extensively on matters of cultural identity and Bengali nationalism. In what ways did cultural identity shape Bangabandhu's vision of an independent Bangladesh?
Everything. So we are a very proud nation, and we actually take pride in our language, our culture. And you can see I was flying from Melbourne today, but I'm wearing sari because that's me. And I feel it's like, it just makes me me. So we are a very proud nation, but it's a great segue from what Mark was talking about and what Professor Gareth Evans was talking about, that human aspect of relationship, because that transcends everything beyond the geopolitical or, you know, the other issues. And I believe to celebrate the Golden Jubilee of Bangladesh and the bipartisan relationship, 50 years of Bangladesh and Australia, we cannot really talk about anything else rather than acknowledging that how the power of inclusive and accessible education in public plays a role in public diplomacy, which is more people-to-people diplomacy, which is absolutely important. As an academic, I believe that education is one of the most important aspects, if not the most, in this bilateral relationship. In last 50 years, tens and thousands of Australian Bangladeshis call Australia home, and they came here as a student. And Professor Glover, you were talking about the students, international students, and I believe that international students, like Bangladeshi international students, like any other international students, they are our cultural diplomats, and their work, like in everyday people-to-people conversation, which actually the things Honorable His Excellence, the High Commissioner here, Mr. Rahman, EU Consulate General, the things you are doing at the, the foreign policy level or in the embassies and High Commission, the students are doing it at the person-to-person level. And that I would say that creates a real strong bond between Bangladesh and Australia, because even the people in Bangladesh, those who never visited Australia or never will come to Australia, they feel affiliation because their family live here, their friends live here. So this is really, really crucial. So the students like me who came to study here, and in 20 years' time, I have got 2 homes, one in Dhaka, one in Melbourne. I have got 2 passports. I've got 2 cricket teams. I have got 2 national anthems to sing. And I have got 2 flags to be proud of. On the other hand, we have got the students like Professor Imtiaz Ahmed, who studied here, went back to Bangladesh, but still they are working as the think tank of that country and working in the diplomatic section or other parts of the government policymakers. So the human aspect of that diplomacy is so important, where education plays a crucial role in there. So I believe that's where Bangabandhu and Whitlam really fascinates me, both of them, because they were the leaders of 2 different countries, which are culturally very different, but they were at the same time very short span of their ruling time, but they had really, really very close, their hearts were in education. So the way Whitlam looked at the education, the accessibility of education, inclusiveness of education in Australia, Bangabandhu had the same dream in terms of the Bangladesh. And I was listening to Tania Plebiscite, Honorable, one of the opposition politicians now. She was talking in 2019, she was saying that whenever I meet someone in their 60s and 70s in Australia every week, who reminds me about how Gough Whitlam was responsible for them going to university, I can relate it so well because my mom just turned 70 this year. So she went to the University of Dhaka in 69, 70, that period of time. And she talks about Bangabandhu with a zeal, saying that how Bangabandhu's passion for passion and vision, because he was a visionary leader, passion and vision for Bangla culture, Bangla language, made even the girls of that time to come and aspire to be part of the education. So I think that all these talks about geopolitical perspective, which you are all expert of, which I'm not, but I will say as an academic, as an educationist, I think education is the core of that bipartisan relationship of ours. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Rahman. We might actually pick up some of that passion in terms of education, but perhaps to you, Kim, Gough Whitlam had a great interest in the arts, in history and in culture. How do you think that translated into his appreciation of diverse cultures in Australia and the region?
Oh, I think it was fundamental to his view of the world. He was a great reformer, but his reform was always in the service of social development, particularly in education and social infrastructure, in terms of culture, particularly in terms of shared values with Bangabandhu in terms of literature, history, music, food. These were things that were fundamental to him. And then finally, of course, politics and diplomacy, where they were both multilateralists. And Gough was an indefatigable advocate for a multilateral system and saw multilateralism as being the only solution path to a sane world.
Do you think that the internationalism that you've referred to with Gough was a product of his particular upbringing? And how do you think it developed in the light of his own experience?
Well, he grew up in a very well-educated family, and it was a family that was literate to the power of insert very large number here. In fact, the family would all retire after dinner to read and would read voraciously. And undoubtedly, Gough's father, who made him repeat the leaving certificate 3 times because he first graduated when he was 15 and he didn't want him going to a university at 15. So Gough not only sat 3 times, but came first 3 times in a row as the dux of all students. He was immensely influenced by his dad, and his dad was a true, as Jenny mentioned, a true international spirit and someone who was deeply committed to human rights.
Thank you, Kim. Professor Islam, Bangabandhu was immersed in politics, as we saw in the presentation from Professor Ahmed, from a very young age. From the first seeds of India's independence from Britain through to the creation, of course, of Bangladesh. Do you see changes in his understanding of colonialism over that time?
Of course. Thank you very much, Honorable Chair and Vice Chancellor. Now, Bangabandhu basically reconstructed the idea of colonialism and its self-determination, particularly when in 1960, United Nations adopted its decolonization declaration. At that time, that basically outlawed all colonialism. Colonial possessions are outlawed, mainly European colonialism retreated and emerged too many colonies as independent states. And in this picture, in this context, what Bangabandhu did, Bangabandhu basically challenged the status quo understanding of colonialism and its corresponding right to colonial self-determination after independence. With the 1960 decolonization declaration, in international law, there emerged a principle, a rule called one time only rule. And that rule says that a colony once achieves its independence through colonial self-determination, that right is extinguished. In other words, the law says, international law says that once you are independent, there is no room for exercising colonial self-determination again. Bangabandhu stood against that. Bangabandhu argued that if colonialism and colonial self-determination is the right of the oppressed dependent colonial people and not the oppressed people in an independent state, that means right to self-determination belongs to the territory, not to the people. But that is jurisprudentially unsubsumable. So he argued that if colonial condition entitles a colonial people to self-determination, so does if a group of people is targeted and it is politically subjugated, economically exploited, socially discriminated against, then that group, although once exercised its colonial self-determination, he meant 1947 independence of Pakistan. He argued that after 25 years of internal colonialism of Pakistan government, Bengali people's right to colonial self-determination resuscitated again. And that's how he justified his unilateral declaration of independence, basically. So it's basically he deconstructed the traditional idea of colonialism and introduced a new element, a human element, in the sense that the whole thing became a people-oriented right, and eventually, initially, yes, I think our foreign minister mentioned that United Nations changed, the Secretary General changed his view in 1971, December. But if you look at the history before, then Bangladesh colonial self-determination, successful one was the first ever in post-colonial context. The earlier two, Katanga from Congo and Biafra from Nigeria, failed. And Secretary General of the United Nations, Uthand, formally declared that UN will never accept the secession of a group of people from an independent state, because UN cannot do anything that is inimical to its interest, because its power base is member state. So it supported that the territorial integrity of Congo, and you know, the United Nations even fought the Belgian troops in Congo. Now, what Bangabandhu did, after the independence, same Secretary General in his report that our foreign minister mentioned, said that what can you do when territorial integrity is used to oppress its own people? UN cannot protect the territorial integrity of that state. And matter didn't end there. United Nations had to revise its charter governing principle in Article 1 and 2 in particular. And in its 1970 70 Declaration on Friendly Relation, which is a reinterpretation of its self-determination, it argued that yes, self-determination can exist in independent state, and in Principle 5, it imposes an injunction on state not to use force to deny self-determination. And virtually in another final paragraph, it says that UN will protect the territorial integrity of only those states that conduct themselves according to equal rights and self-determination. So the point I'm trying to make is Bangabandhu, through this political act, reshaped the direction of the international law and contributed to the progressive development of international law and relations. And that you can see that after that, Baltic states, Soviet states, Balkan state, now Spanish Catalonia are asserting their right. And of course, International Court of Justice recognized Bangabandhu's interpretation in 2010, its judgment on Kosovo unilateral declaration of independence. So it has got enormous impact on international law and relations.
Thank you. As I imagined, thank you. As I imagined, we would not have time for questions because we were, I think, able to enjoy the presentations very much from our panel members. It's been a tour de force to some extent of the contributions we've had from our esteemed panelists and our great presenters, great insight into Bangabandhu and Gough Whitlam, and to be able to celebrate the 50th anniversary and the centenary of the birth of Bangabandhu. So please join me with a thank you to our panel members, and I'll go back to the Chancellor.
It has indeed been a tour de force. So thank you, Dr. Islam, Dr. Rahman, Mr. Mac Williams and Mr. Kim Williams, and to the Vice Chancellor for moderating that. I wish we had twice the amount of time, but time is always, unfortunately, the enemy. I now want to ask the Consul General of Bangladesh, Mr. Kondakar Masudar Alam, to say just a few closing remarks. Mr. Alam is our first ever Consul General of Bangladesh in Sydney. He started here in March 2019. He is a career diplomat. He's been a member of the Bangladesh Foreign Service since May in 2003. And in his diplomatic career, he's worked in the Dhaka headquarters of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as well as in the Bangladesh embassies in Stockholm and Sweden, and Seoul, and now Sydney. He's specialising in S's, clearly. He's participated in numerous bilateral and multilateral arrangements. He is, by training, an electrical and electronic engineer, also holds an MBA degree from the Institute of Business Administration in Dhaka University and an MA majoring in international economics from Hiroshima University, Japan.
Thank you very much, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. We have been listening to this, captivating discussions for last 2 hours. And I think we have grasped what everyone has to made, the points about these two towering leaders. I'm here mainly to thank, because it's a big lot of people that have been working behind this. And I had to write about 2 pages so that I don't miss anyone who have been, engaged in making today's event successful. Let me start with thanking our 2 captivating speakers who encapsulated the great ideas, visions, and the ideals that Bangabandhu and Prime Minister Whitlam actually stood for in just 10-15 minutes of time. We were actually thinking who to speak in these occasions, and we have been fortunate to have the likes of Professor Imtiaz Ahmed and Professor Jenny Hocking as today's speaker, who have mastery in studying in persons, and who have discussed this afternoon to celebrate multiple significant occasions: the birth centenary of Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, Golden Jubilee of Bangladesh, and 50 years of Bangladesh-Australia relations. They both had deep insights of the 2 leaders that they were talking about, and they have encapsulated the ideas in their speeches. I thank them from my heart. I cannot thank our Honorable Foreign Minister, Dr. A.K. Abdul Momen, MP, enough for joining the event and delivering his opening remarks. As I was liaising with his office, it was really difficult to secure his time. He was parallelly engaged with many other events, as you can imagine. And he was also, like Senator Payne, was supposed to visit to South Korea. Unfortunately for us, they have moved to virtual format so that we could have him for a longer time here. He was initially planning to connect from South Korea to join this event today. But it was fortunate for us that he could do it from sitting in his office in Bangladesh. And because he was prioritizing this, he is a person who authored several books on Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. We're also honored by the presence of Honorable Gareth Evans. He is by himself an institution with all the contributions that he has made nationally and internationally. His participation is a fitting tribute to the leaders that we have just discussed in our seminar today. I thank him for sending his remarks for today's opening session. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to express our deep appreciation to Chancellor Professor Sheikh. He has gone, extra miles, I would say. He has been emceeing this whole event. We have never expected that he would do so, but he did. That shows the level of interest he took in this event and the level of effort he put behind it. Also, Professor Barney Glover, the Vice Chancellor, who has kept this initiative alive for last 1 year. He was the one who grasped the idea of having this seminar the moment our High Commissioner pitched it during a discussion they were having, I think, next door about a year back. I thank him for keeping it alive and making it a fruition today.